Hey everybody, it is Gordon Majak here, back with another episode of Timeless Pop, Rock, and Soul. And this time around, we are going to pick it up right where we left off in the previous video with Blood, Sweat, and Tears. You've made me so very happy. Let's pick the story up right there. So Blood, Sweat, and Tears releases that song. It goes on to become a big hit, as I mentioned, and so do the next two singles, Spinning Wheel and When I Die. And Blood, Sweat, and Tears is rolling in 1969. Now, as I mentioned, producer James William Guercio, who produced the Blood, Sweat, and Tears album, was actually already Chicago's manager at the time that he produced the Blood, Sweat, and Tears album, and he hadn't yet gotten Chicago signed to Columbia Records. But partially because of the success of the Blood, Sweat, and Tears album, and because he basically salvaged their career for the label at that point, early on in their career, the label immediately signed Chicago, and the next thing you know, Chicago was in the studio with Guercio working on their first album, which was, as you may remember, this monster. And I call it a monster because I don't know what else to call it. It is just a monster album. The debut from Chicago there in April of 1969, the Chicago Transit Authority. So Chicago releases this album, their first album, with producer Jim Guercio. Meanwhile, Blood, Sweat, and Tears is just taking off. They are front and center, front page news. They are soaking up all the attention and all the limelight there in the jazz rock genre, right? So Chicago, a few months later they're trying to get established, trying to get this record played, trying to get on the radio, trying to do whatever they can to generate a little interest in this Chicago Transit Authority album. And in August of 1969, they released the song that we're going to hear here in a second, Questions 67 and 68, which was written by Chicago's keyboardist and vocalist Robert Lamm. Chicago released Questions 67 and 68 as a single in August of 1969, and it got all the way up to, wait for it, number 71 on the charts. Not much of a dent made from that first Chicago single. And you hardcore Chicago fans may remember, somewhat comedically, on the Chicago Live at Carnegie Hall album, when Terry Kath introduces this song and he says, "This here song was our first Boss hit-bound single that never was a Boss hit-bound single. It's called Questions 67 and 68. So not much of a response from the record-buying public or the music world the first time around for Questions 67 and 68. And as a matter of fact, it wasn't until the following year, 1970, when Chicago released their second album, and then they had three big hits in a row, right there in a row in 1970. It started with Make Me Smile, and then 25 or 6 to 4 was a big hit. And then Columbia went back to the Chicago Transit Authority album and started pulling the singles out of there. And we got another big hit in Does Anybody Really Know What Time It Is? And then another big hit in Beginnings. And finally, in 1971, Columbia edited this song, Questions 67 and 68, did another edit of it and re-released it again after the success of those previous singles, after Make Me Smile and 25 or 6 to 4 and Does Anybody Really Know What Time It Is. They released it again, and the second time around, Questions 67 and 68 finally got all the way up into the top 25 on the pop chart. But at that point, the success of this particular song was pretty much moot because Chicago was off and running. And here you have Blood, Sweat, and Tears just taking off like a rocket there with those three hit singles in 1969, completely overshadowing Chicago's start to their career. But it's like once Chicago got their traction there on the radio with a couple hit records the following year, I think that was pretty much it for Blood, Sweat, and Tears. Blood, Sweat, and Tears, no doubt about it, just a fabulously talented group of individuals. They did so many cool arrangements and so many cool cover songs. David Clayton Thomas, like I said, such a charismatic frontman. But man, not to slight Blood, Sweat, and Tears in any way, but Chicago had the whole thing working there. Again, a super talented band of musicians, a very charismatic lead guitarist out there in Terry Kath, and such a balanced approach with 3 lead vocals. You had Robert Lamm and Terry Kath, and this song's actually sung by Peter Cetera, his first vocal on a Chicago song there in 1969. So Chicago really had the whole thing working, and you still got some of those similar traits that were in the Blood, Sweat, and Tears. I think Robert Lamm said once that the difference in the bands was that Blood, Sweat, and Tears were primarily a jazz group or a group of jazz musicians who could play rock, whereas Chicago was very clearly a group of rock musicians who could also play jazz and did occasionally. But they really were coming from different places, even though their sounds may have sort of intersected and crossed over at various times with one another. But that is the story behind the song. Let's just get to it, man. This was another one of those albums. I mentioned stopping at my friend's house. This was the album I didn't mention. This was one of the other albums on the way home from school there in the spring of 1969. This was another one of the albums that we found in my friend's older brother's record collection, along with the Blood, Sweat, and Tears and Three Dog Night and some other things that I mentioned in the last video. This was one of those records, hey, what's this? Let's see what this is all about. And just like the Blood, Sweat, and Tears, you put this one on and you're just sitting there going, what is this? This doesn't sound like any of this other stuff. And I think with the Chicago, the thing I always dug, I mean, first of all, this whole album is just crazy anyway. There's so much incredible music on this album. But the thing about that I always loved about Questions 67 and 68 is it combines so many of those classical Chicago elements into one great 5-minute song. And you get, as I mentioned, just this dynamite drumming by Danny Seraphine, who, as I said before, right there with Bobby Colomby, the 2 real main pioneers of the jazz rock sound in the pop world for the wider audience. You get that great rhythm section with Terry Kath on guitar and Peter Cetera on bass and Danny Seraphine on drums and Robert Lamm on keyboards. And then, of course, you combine that with the horn section and some pretty incredible lead vocals by Peter Cetera on this, as you'll hear. Peter's letting it rip and showing what he's got. And I just always thought that Chicago sound right out of the gate with this first album, there was even though I love the Blood, Sweat, and Tears, I mean, I love it enough to have played it, and I would even play some more of their stuff. I love the Blood, Sweat, and Tears sound, but there was just a punch and a heaviness and there was a real impact behind the Chicago stuff. In the rhythm section in particular, that I didn't get that same vibe from Blood, Sweat, and Tears. And certainly, maybe that came from the fact that the guitarists, the role of the guitar in the 2 bands could have played a part in that. Think about it. If this was their first single, this was the first thing, even though it only got up to number 71 there in 1969. Even though it only got up to number 71, somebody heard this record. And if you were one of those people that heard this single, this was your first exposure to Chicago, this was what you heard. You heard Peter Cetera singing high and tight and those horns blasting and Terry Kath doing those runs on the guitar. And there it was. There was the Chicago sound in its earliest stage. And so, from 1969 and that great Chicago Trance Authority, what a debut album. It is a Robert Lamm composition, a James William Guercio production, and Peter Cetera on his first Chicago vocals. Let's hear it, guys. The thing that kills me about this is how Chicago just exploded onto the scene with such a fully realized sound right from the very first album. And that's the thing that always stuck with me so much about this first album. What a monster record. This was one of the first albums I ever bought there in the early 1970s. And man, I had, as I've mentioned before in other videos, Chicago, this era of Chicago, this is it for me, for those first 10 albums of Chicago, the first 10 years there, I guess, with the Terry Kath era. That's just as good as it gets for me, and it's always been my favorite catalog of music. And just incredible to me the way they started. These guys are all just in their early 20s on this first record, and they're just letting it rip. It's like they've been doing it for 10 years, and they hadn't. They'd only been together for less than 2 years, and they just sound so fully formed and so fully realized. That's what always just got me about this one. There's a long fade out. I'm just going to let it go until it stops. Yeah, it's just so interesting to go back there and listen to the early Blood, Sweat, and Tears in the early Chicago and sort of compare who was doing what and how they were accomplishing their goals. As I said, certainly cannot disparage Blood, Sweat, and Tears in any way, shape, or form. Just incredible musicianship in that band, and certainly some superstars, some musical superstars in that group as well. And Bobby Clumby, one, as I mentioned. And of course, some of those horn players are just absolutely ridiculous in that band. So there's definitely the talent there in Blood, Sweat, and Tears. David Clayton Thomas, as I said, what a charismatic lead singer he was. But I think Chicago had that secret weapon, or maybe a couple secret weapons. First of all, they had multiple lead singers, which always kept things very interesting because Robert Lamm was singing lead on the majority of the songs actually there in the beginning. Terry Kath and Peter Cetera, obviously strong singers themselves, putting it mildly. So Chicago had the three singers, but I think the secret weapon of all that Chicago had, that Blood, Sweat, and Tears didn't have, was that Chicago had their superstars too, but one of them happened to be the guitarist. And that's just, that having that engine and that soul and that driver in the rhythm section in the form of Terry Kath, that was something Blood, Sweat, and Tears, and nobody else for that matter, was ever going to be able to match. But certainly Blood, Sweat, and Tears could never come up with anything like that. And so there was the sort of the big difference right out of the gate there with Chicago, having Terry Kath separated them not only from Blood, Sweat, and Tears, but from so many of these other groups that were doing the jazz rock sort of progressive thing back there in the late 60s and early 70s. And how about Peter Cetera tearing it up on that bass and hitting those high notes? And, you know, I will say that I was fortunate to see that original lineup of Chicago there 5 times in the 70s with Terry Kath and Peter Cetera and Danny Seraphine on drums and Robert Lamm, the whole original lineup. And it was pretty darn cool. I think I saw them do this twice back in the day. And man, it was so cool to see them go back to the very beginning and pick up what was an album track, right? This was an album track. It never was a big hit. So the other hits always got the attention, but it was pretty cool to see the band still appreciated Question 67 and 68. And they played this for many years there into the later days of the Terry Kath era. So that was always cool to see, and it always sounded great live. Of course, Peter Cetera always rose to the occasion on this one and belted those high ones, man. Jazz rock, huh? I think now that's what they call Steely Dan, right? Steely Dan's probably more properly jazz rock, but Chicago and Blood, Sweat, and Tears just came at it from a different direction. I think they could legitimately claim if they wanted to. Maybe they didn't even like those names. I know Chicago wasn't that fond. Peter Cetera certainly wasn't that fond of that term, and I suspect some of the other members as well didn't like being compared to Blood, Sweat, and Tears. But there's room enough at the top for everybody, right? Or at least there was there for a very short time before the Blood, Sweat, and Tears party came to an end and Chicago blasted off into the stratosphere in the 70s. Coming back tomorrow with some more, folks. I will see you then, and we'll see where the muse takes us. See you then.